Hi, this is a lecture on the Lenin and Trotsky reading. I'm Lenin and Trotsky. So you know who Lenin and Trotsky are, I imagine. Lenin was the first head of the Politburo, the first leading figure in the Soviet Revolution. He had been around Germany and Russia, involved with revolutionary activity for a good 15 years before that happened, maybe 20 years. But he becomes the first supreme leader of the Soviet Union. And he's the guy whose body they had in Moscow. I think it might even still be there, preserved so that all the Soviet people could see their, inspired leader. That's Lenin. And it's important, I suppose, to recognize that he, rather like, say, like Robespierre, and sort of like Thomas Paine, is a person who was both intellectually active and practically active. And there's some merit in that, I think. They have really strong theoretical understandings of the situations that they're in, of what should be done in those situations, of the history that led to their situation. This is true for Robespierre and Paine and Lenin and Trotsky. And on the other hand, they're centrally involved in altering these circumstances. They're revolutionary leaders and actors. It's true for Frantz Fanon. It's true for Stokely Carmichael. It's true for tons of people that we look at in this class. Lenin, let's start with Lenin. And really what I want to do first is to describe the historical context that we're looking at. The three texts that we have here, we have a section of Lenin's What Is to Be Done, published in 1902, a section of his book State and Revolution, published in 1916 or 1917. I'll even tell you a little bit about his book On Imperialism, written in 1917, published in 1917. That's a lot of work, by the way, in the year that you're a central leader in a revolution, also to publish a couple books. Fairly impressive. And then Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed, was written in 1934 as he was in exile in Norway. These texts are pretty good reference points for talking about history. So the book, What Is to Be Done, is written in 1902, and it sort of lines up and becomes important in 1905, because in 1905, the Russian Revolution almost happens. It doesn't happen really till 1917. Why 1905? What was it that was going on then? Well, there had been a modernization effort in Russia in the late 1800s. This is happening at exactly the same time, or nearly, in Japan as well, under Meiji rule. Both of those places, and probably around the same time, Turkey, a number of Middle Eastern places. These are places that, if they weren't under colonial rule, they were under pressure from colonizing forces. And in Russia and Japan, although they weren't colonized, they were sort of opening themselves up for it in a certain way, and they were attempting to keep up with the industrial development of the colonizer nations, of the capitalist West. In so doing, the Tsar ended up in business relationships with a lot of Western capitalists. And here we're talking about the late 1880s and the 1890s. And this pissed off a whole lot of people. He had invested a lot of money in the development of train lines. So, when you're developing a capitalist system, when you're developing an industrial base, one of the first things that you have to do is lay down infrastructure, and especially transportation infrastructure. So they set up train lines, and they set up more manufacturing. But they basically the Tsar opened Russia to foreign banker investment. As a part, probably, or as a continuation of this process of the industrialization of Russia in its attempt to catch up to the more fully industrialized West, because Russia was largely agrarian at this point. It was still feudal in a lot of ways. Big landowners and serfed peasantry. Technically, they stopped being serfs in the 1860s, I think. You can check out my PowerPoint for these exact dates. But they're kept in a condition very much like servitude right up until the 1900s. And as a part of this general industrialization push, Russia is also seeking to control ports, and specifically ports in their east. And in this, they ran into conflict with the Japanese. So the Russo-Japanese War happens 1904, 1905. And it's 1905 that sees all these revolts all over Russia. Massive strikes, massive state suppression of strikes. And I think we can get a lesson from this. What's the lesson? The lesson is that there are some features that are typical of revolutionary circumstances. They don't guarantee revolution in the same way that, the setting up of maroon communities in Haiti doesn't guarantee revolution, but it makes it more possible, makes it more likely. The things that we can see happening in Russia in 1904, 1905 are shortened food supplies, financial instability due to lending that was being aggressively pushed by Western bankers, and then, quite important, this war over control of ports with Japan. So what happens in this war is that the Tsar sends hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers to fight, and 80,000 of them die, and then they lose. So a lost war, a war in which there are many casualties. That's a real good circumstance to cause a population really to start doubting the wisdom and the legitimacy of their government. So around this time there are tons of strikes, there are tons of uprisings. They have to be suppressed. There's one in particular at the Winter Palace in 1905, so just at the center of the Russian government, where something like 1,000 people are shot by Russian troops, by Tsarist troops. And one thing that happens, so you can go check out Battleship Potemkin. That's a movie made by Sergei Eisenstein, one of the most famous filmmakers ever. And it's about a mutiny on the battleship Potemkin in 1905. So it's commemorating this year of uprising. In that case, the rank and file soldiers turn against their officers and take over their ship. This happened in a number of places. And in 1917, this would be a pivotal thing, especially in Petrograd, that certain portions of the soldiery organized themselves into Soviets, so-called Soviets, equal communal units, and they turned against the overall structure of rule. It happened in the French Revolution too, that there are these pivotal moments where the soldiers shift their allegiance from their officers and the ruling class and put their forces, their services, their ability, their guns at the service of the general population, which is in a moment of uprising against the ruling classes. So, it's a lost war, a whole lot of death in the war, problems in eating. So just a general increase of suffering, but also a decrease in the sense of the legitimacy, the effectiveness, the capacity of the government to govern in a way that is suitable. Okay, so that's when he writes What is to be Done, and I'll tell you about the content of that. Secondly, 1916, 1917. Of course, 1914 is a huge year. It's a huge year because that's when World War I starts. Russia gets involved in World War I and eventually loses, is pushed back, and has to cede a whole lot of territory to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that happens, that ceding of territory to the Austro-Hungarian Empire happens just as the Russian Revolution happens. So Tsarist Russia never gets a chance to come back and win World War I, even though the Austro-Hungarian Empire is eventually defeated from the West. And this is different from World War II, of course, because in World War II, it is Stalinist Russia that defeats the Germans. They lose millions and millions of people in this effort. The 1917 uprising happens in a circumstance that is similar to the 1905 uprising, because the war produced scarcity of food, produced increased terror on the part of the Tsarist secret police. That's another thing that happened in the run-up to 1905. More and more violence, more and more torture, more and more spying on the part of the secret police. And so instead of thinking that, well, the stronger the state is and the more surveillance it does and the more police activity it's engaged in, you might think the stronger its hold on power gets. But this is not actually true. What happens is that the increase in state terror, state violence, state suppression of a population tends to move in a fairly regular synchronization with revolutionary activity itself, with revolutionary organizing. They tend to amplify one another. In the same way that we'll see in Algeria, that state torture and terrorism, non-state actor terrorism, FLN terrorism, they amplified in kind of lockstep with one another. You have a sort of feedback loop going on there. Anyway, so 1917 was another opportunity for the revolutionaries in Russia to depose the Tsarist regime, and in this case, it worked. It worked largely because there were spontaneous uprisings all across Russia and the spontaneous formation of a wide variety of different styles of Soviet, of communes. But then the difference between, Marxist-Leninist organization and anarchist organization is that those quite different Soviets, instead of retaining their local power, their local autonomy, were forced into a centralized regime by the Bolsheviks across the next 5 years or so. So from 1918 to 1923, Russia is involved in a so-called civil war. I say so-called because it's not exactly just a civil war, and that's probably true for almost every civil war. I mean, the civil war in the U.S. is probably the closest thing I know to an actual splitting in half of the nation in terms of interests. Usually there are outside forces too. So this civil war in Russia, internally, it involves the Red Army, which is the army led by Trotsky, who we're also reading, and commanded by Lenin, practically led by Trotsky. The political head is Lenin. It's that army versus the so-called White Army. The White Army is the remnants of the officer corps who had been loyal to the Tsar, together with reactionary, conservative, and especially religious peasants across Russia. So there was this fight for hearts and minds, and the Bolsheviks in particular were quite involved in propaganda efforts. They were sending trains. You can check out a PowerPoint called Agitprop that I have listed. They set up trains with like all kinds of bright, decorative messaging on the outside, pictures of the leaders, and then they had inside the car, they would have a cinema where you could sit down and watch movies, watch these kind of like propaganda movies. So anyway, 1918 to 1923, there's this civil war happening. There's a whole lot of agitation attempting to get portions of the population to support the Red Army versus the White Army. And insofar as it is the remnants of the old regime versus the new power structure of the Bolsheviks, it is a civil war. But insofar as, I think it's like 14 other nations send troops, including the United States, send troops and money to support the white regime, because the whites, though they were backwards, supported a system that was largely feudal, recognized a tight and important relationship between the state and the church, which these seem in certain ways like backwards positions. Nevertheless, remember that the Tsar had opened up Russia to foreign investment. He was open to capitalist development, probably been forced into that position. And so the United States, for example, wanted a czarist Russia. This is true right up to the present. We supposedly are delivering democracy together with capitalism as if they went together, which I don't think they do, to the rest of the world, right? We're told. Common sense has it that's what we're doing. Our media tells us that's what we're doing. Our government tells us that's what we're doing. But in fact, if you actually look at the regimes that the United States supports, they're often dictatorial and anti-democratic, because that's what capital likes. Capital, by which I mean capitalists in the global north, they like to put their money in places where a heavily armed state apparatus will protect it, and they like to employ people. They like to set up factories in places where the state apparatus guarantees that there will, for example, be no unionization, that there will be no nationalization, that the factory is safe, that the wages will stay low. There was this kind of relationship between the Western banking nations and Tsarist Russia. And of course, a lot of exchange, ongoing, almost aristocratic exchange between members of the ruling classes. So Russians hung out in Paris all the time, and Parisians hung out in Russia, but only the members of the highest classes. So 1918 to 1923 is that civil war. Trotsky is the effective leader of the Red Army. He's brutal. For example, he doesn't have enough officers to really make his military machine run well, so he has to recruit them from the officer corps who used to serve the Tsar, but he doesn't trust, justly, he doesn't trust those officers to maintain their allegiance to the Red Army. And so he does things like takes their family hostage and warns them that if their passions fade, if it looks like they're not working hard enough, not even, should they betray the Red Army, if they lose battles, then Trotsky will have their family destroyed, and he follows through on these threats. So it's really hardcore, full-on militaristic rule. Now, nevertheless, Trotsky ends up being the most famous critic of the Stalinist regime. So Lenin is in power until technically until 1924, but his power, that's when he dies. But his power's waning in the couple of years before that because he has a series of strokes and he becomes less capable than he once was. Apparently he was a totally brilliant individual. And as his power backs off, figures like Trotsky and Stalin are sort of vying to be the new central figure. Stalin prevails. He's not able immediately to push Trotsky out, but eventually he is. And Trotsky goes into exile, and he writes this text, The Revolution Betrayed, from exile. And in it, he says basically what he thinks went wrong with the Soviet regime. Okay, so this is the historical picture. I'll add only one more element to it, because I want to raise this basic question. The question is, who is we? We often say we when referring to the United States government. So, for example, we'll say, we went into Iraq shortly after September 11th, 2001. So 2002, we went into Iraq. But unless there are people in this class who are more like my age and military veterans, none of us went into Iraq, right? There are a whole lot of us use this kind of language when we are not the ones who went. We identify ourselves with the state, with the government, with the military. So we think that we are the Americans, and the Americans is the same thing as its government. The Leninist point of view challenges that very question. So let me give you a very quick overview of Lenin's analysis of World War I, because it's World War I that facilitates the Bolshevik takeover of Russia. Because that regime was so terribly weakened by that war, because it had allowed the death of so many soldiers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, its hold over the population had weakened. Its perceived legitimacy had weakened. The love of the population for the government had weakened. And that identification of the population with its leadership, which has to be carefully constructed and sustained. And you're really lucky if you have a basically allegiant media apparatus, as we do, in maintaining that ideological support, that idea that, oh, me and what the government does, oh, we're the same thing. We are America. Well, this stuff breaks apart in the run-up to revolutionary situations. Okay, so at that moment, how does Lenin understand World War I? And recognize also, so this is a text that I didn't give you. I used to give it in class, but I want to talk about it just for a moment, called On Imperialism. He wrote that text also because, as I said earlier, the Russians lost a whole lot of territory, which they then were able to take back in the coming years. In 1917, they signed an armistice which ceded a tremendous amount of territory, and this was the Bolsheviks that did this in the end of 1917. Basically, there are two revolutions actually. There's a sort of parliamentary democratic reformist revolution that takes place in spring. I want to say like March or something. 1917. It's led by a social democrat named Kerensky. But then there's a coup in October, led especially by Trotsky, which puts the Bolsheviks into power. So that's the October Revolution. After the October Revolution, the Soviets back out of World War I. They make this like agreement, which is not at all happy for them to cede all this territory. And so Lenin has to justify why he made this move. And On Imperialism is his answer. And the basic picture that book draws, I mean, I think that's a really cool text. It's hard to read because it's got lots of numbers in it, but if you can make it through it, it's really interesting because in a lot of ways it feels like it was written about a couple years ago instead of 100 years ago. And what it says is, look, the world wars come from capitalist, colonialist expansion. That's their source. They're not about local nationalism. They're not about, competing patriotisms. They're not just about military expansion. They're first of all about a history of economic/military expansion, which we know as colonialism. Why is this the case, or how is this the case? Well, basically the story that Lenin tells, which I think is persuasive, look at the 1800s and then the late 1800s in terms of colonialist expansion. So we saw the very beginning of this wave of colonialism in the 1500s with Spain taking over the Americas. And then in the 1700s, we see France and Britain become the dominant colonial powers, place of Spain. Spain fades into the background. In the 1800s, colonialism moves over to focus especially on, India, and China, and especially on Africa. What happens? I mean, it's like the last 20 or 30 years of the 1800s, 80 to 90% of Africa is colonized. So there's this big takeover of land. The British move into India. The British and the French, and a bit of the Dutch, are all over Africa. The British are in India. The British are pushing on China. South America has largely liberated itself in the course of the 1800s before it will again be subjected to what I would call neo-colonial regimes by the middle of the 20th century. And the basic point that Lenin makes is Britain and France and Germany, these major economic powers, major colonial powers, basically ran out of easy land. For a long time, they were able to take new land, new resources, even to develop new markets without encountering any military force or economic force in any way comparable to their own. They were always the one with the big gun. They were always the one with the advanced technology through the 1800s. So colonialism is preying upon the weak. It's preying upon nations and peoples which have far less capacity militarily to defend themselves. But that ran out. And how then should we understand World War I and then by extension World War II? Well, what happens is that capitalism needs to expand. Remember, what capital is. Capital is perpetually accumulating value, and it has to keep investing again and accumulating again, or else it ceases to be capital. Capitalism is not happening unless further profit is being generated. There always has to be profit. And how do you continue to increase profit? You have to expand your access to resources, and you have to expand your access to markets. Capitalism needs colonialism. And colonialism shows that there is always a militaristic, hyper-violent aspect to capitalism. And when capitalism and colonialism run out of easy land to take, then the capitalists have to turn on one another. So World War I, with the Austro-Hungarians on one side and the French and the British on another, is a war of capitalist nations versus one another. And so Lenin is able to say, that's why we backed out of the war, because it's not really our war. Now, this is the position I wanted to get to. I mean, I want you to understand this history. We're looking at a single history through the course of this class. The question that is raised by all this stuff that I want you to really think about is this one. Who is we? Do we identify? Should we identify with the state, with its representatives, with the president, or with the richest people, the richest interests in our country? Because Lenin's view is, Marx's view is, my view is that foreign policy, economic policy, even the generation of wars, is really dependent upon the interests of the ruling class. They're the ones in power. They're the ones that are determining what is to happen. And so the Marxist view on war, which is one that I share too, says, okay, large-scale war, and actually it doesn't even have to be large-scale, state-sponsored war, is really about the interests of one small group of capitalists over here versus the interests of another small group of capitalists over here. Think about the kind of saber-rattling between the U.S. and Russia right now, which is kind of weird because, so Rex Tillerson, so long as he's still in office, goes and hangs out in Russia, and he sees people that he knows all the time. Same thing for Trump, where he go to Russia. They already know one another because they already do business together. They're different capitalists. They have different holdings. They are engaged in different strategies to erode one another's resources and markets and profit. But on the other hand, they're playing the same game. So it's their interests. It's the interests of one group of capitalists associated with a nation state and another group of capitalists associated with another nation state that produces large-scale wars, that produced the world wars. And this means that this is the fight. It's between this capitalist group and this capitalist group. But remember, on the Marxist analysis, each one of these groups is what it is. It's the ruling class. It is the capitalist, only insofar as it has a big population underneath it, which it exploits. So the truth is, from a Marxist point of view, the working class has one primary enemy, and it's the owning class. It's the ruling class. Same thing over here. Like say, okay, this is England. and this is Germany. Different group of capitalists playing by the same rules and with the same relationship to the German working class population. They exploit this population in order to make themselves ever more wealthy and maintain their position from which they have the capacity for further exploitation. Now recognize there's also this function of ideology. The working class, let's now move over to the United States. The working class objectively has interests which are completely distinct from the interests of the owning class. Owners, they want to pay as little as possible. They want to give as little health care as possible. They want to give as little job security as possible. The interests of the working class are opposite in each of these respects. The working class wants to get paid more. It wants more benefits. It wants more job security, and it needs these things. And it needs these in a way that these guys don't need it. These guys need these conditions in order to optimize their profit. These people, they need to push their agenda in order to make sure that their kids stay alive. Different stakes. That's the objective relationship between these two. This is an exploitative relationship where the interests of the two are truly opposed. And yet, it comes about a good portion of the time that confusion prevails, that this class fails to see its difference from this class. Now this class, it never loses sight of its interest. It never loses sight of the fact that, like, oh, we got to keep these people down. It knows very clearly. It is not moved by ideology. But this group is. The rule of this group over this group includes a psychological, informational, understanding dimension, which, by the way, is the reason that in a class like this, you're not getting anywhere if you don't start thinking about your own circumstance. The class is worthless otherwise. Part of the rule of the ruling class over the ruled class is the domination of ideology, the domination of general messaging in physical environments and in institutional environments. And so it comes about that this group comes to think of its interest and the ruling class's interest as being the same thing. Same thing happens over here in Germany, right? Now, the ruling class in Germany, the ruling class in the United States is barraging its working class with ideology about their shared interests, their alleged shared interests, their national interests. And so they really want to harp on things like patriotism. We're nothing like those Americans over there. We're nothing like those Germans over there. We're culturally, nationally, maybe even racially different. We have to stick together with ours. They are going to stick together with theirs. They've produced this false sense of unity where none in reality exists. It's only perceived, but it's useful. And it is so strong, the domination of ideology is so strong, this group over here is able to muster hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of troops to go and kill and die for the interests of their illusory common good. Same thing over here. So when these two armies come together, the United States versus the Germans, or the English versus the Germans, the French versus the Germans. When these forces come together and you have real battles and you have real death, what's going on is a tragedy from a Marxist point of view. And I agree, it's a tragedy. Because this person over here who shoots this person and vice versa, they don't know one another. There's no fact about their being enemies. I mean, except insofar as they're thrown onto different sides of a line and there's bullets going back and forth. You can call them enemies, but it's not like this one did something to this one in the past. They don't know one another. And the tragedy is amplified by the fact that, in fact, though they speak different languages, this German over here, or make it the German and the Russian, this German and this Russian actually have way more in common with one another than they do with the ruling class that is sending them to kill and die. So the Marxist, Leninist response to the world wars is like, hey, it's not our war. You know, we are fine with the working class of Germany. The working class is us. And of course, the internationals had organized workers across these international lines. Notice also that the ruling class does not go kill and die by itself. It's not going to do this work. It's not stupid. It's going to get the exploited people who it's taking advantage of in all these other ways, and sometimes killing. It's going to take them and throw them at one another. And in the world wars, millions, tens of millions of them die, beating against one another with all the glory of modern technology. Why? For the interests of these ruling classes, which need, because of habit, because of position, because of the structure of capitalism, they need at all costs to continue to increase their profits. Profits over millions of lives. Okay, that's the context. Now, let's shift over and let's talk about the content of these three texts. I'll start with the state and revolution, because I want to ask the question first. What's the state? And I've talked about this before, but I want to clarify it. When we talk about the state, it's important because the goal of a revolution on Leninist lines is to take control of the state. So, and which is not any longer the goal of a revolutionary movement like the Zapatistas or the movement in Rojava. Those are no longer oriented along these Marxist and Leninist lines. But the dominant model for revolution for the first 3/4 of the 20th century is to take over the state apparatus. So what is the state, or what's the state apparatus? It includes, I made this diagram I think in the last lecture. It includes the prisons, the judicial system, the police, the army, the legislative branch, the executive, all these administrations, institutions for enacting one and another policy. These are all the state, right? And especially the state is defended by, and it acts by, armed force. So we're talking about police and armies. This is the primary concern, but also the prison system. Now, what distinguishes Lenin? Okay, in the long term, then now I'm talking about the state and revolution. Here's what Lenin wanted to do. And what he wanted to do, largely he achieved, and it's pretty directly in line with what Marx recommended, what Marx and Engels recommended in the Communist Manifesto. And that is, they are going to aim to take over the state apparatus. They want to take the guns. They want to defeat the army, but really they want to turn as much of the army as possible, and they want to take control over the machine guns and the tanks and the mustard gas and all these diabolical instruments, which the state always controls. They want to take that stuff, and then they want to use their position of domination in order to change things economically. What is Lenin's definition of the state? I gave you the sort of empirical list of the institutions that are part of the state. Empirically speaking, the state is composed of these different institutions. What is it for? What does a state do? So Lenin's Marxist answer to that, of course, the bourgeois, parliamentary democratic, representative democratic answer will be, well, the state enforces the consensus that is generated by the representatives on behalf of the majority. And so long as the legislation enacted by the representatives is actually in line with the will of the majority, then their imposition of the rules that they have set up by means of force is also supposedly legitimate. Of course, there are problems with majority rule. There's the problems of, like, do the representatives really know the interests of the majority? There's the question whether they actually act in the interests of the majority. The Marxist answer is like, of course they don't. Of course they don't. Look who actually pays, in our case, look who actually pays for their election campaigns. Who do they actually serve? We know very well. It's the ultra rich. So on this Marxist model, what is the state? The state is an organ for the domination, organ meaning like a tool, an instrument, for the domination of one class by another. And what happens in the capitalist world is that the ruling class is quite small. It's this ever-shrinking group of hyper-wealthy people, including people like Donald Trump, the billionaires club, ever-shrinking group of ever more powerful people who are controlling and using all the resources and markets to their advantage and to the detriment of everybody else. The state is what allows the billionaires to stay in power. If there wasn't this massive prison system and this massive police force and this massive army, they couldn't do that. They have to have an armed wing. So the state is like the armed wing of the ruling class. What Lenin wants to achieve is not to destroy the state immediately. Here's a big distinction between Marxists and anarchists. Anarchists is like, well, domination's the problem. We should destroy the means of domination, not take it over for ourselves. But the Marxists are like, no. Your opponents are still going to have power. They're still going to have allies. You need to be armed. So we're going to take over the state apparatus, and now we're going to use that. And you can also think of the reign of the Jacobins during the French Revolution. We're going to use this apparatus of violence now in order to attack a different class. They've been using it to attack the majority, the working class, forever. Now we're going to turn it against them. In Marxist language, this is the dictatorship of the proletariat, where the vanguard, the most advanced and most intelligent and most strategically minded of the working class, which is supposedly the Communist Party, is going to take over the state, and it's going to use the state to suppress the minority. Okay, so it's now armed. The revolutionary vanguard is now armed. So we have the armed Bolsheviks. What are they going to do? The same thing that the Jacobins did. They're going to hunt down their enemies. They're going to hunt down the people who really still want the old regime, who are still loyal to the old regime, who are still connected to capitalists internationally, who were historically connected to the Tsar. And they're going to use this state apparatus to cleanse the country. And they do this. They carry out a period of terror. Lenin kills hundreds of thousands of people in this way. And of course, you can think of the whole period of the Civil War as the period of the consolidation of the power of the Bolsheviks, at the same time that it's the period of pushing the capitalists out of Russia. And they succeed. It's hyper-violent. You know, there's no way, I don't think, to think about a process like this where, you know, plenty of innocent people certainly were killed through this rough and unethical use of power. And arguably all use of power is unethical. Maybe we are, as Nietzsche says, beyond good and evil when we talk about this stuff. The Russians actually succeed, the Bolsheviks actually succeed in pushing capitalist and czarist influence out of Russia. Then what do? They're following Marx's guidebook. They nationalize everything. So where we previously had private property, we had individuals and individual companies holding large assets like factories and pieces of land, which they were able to derive value from. They were able to use their property in order to achieve real inequality and to exploit some people in order to improve themselves. And the working class gets worse and worse and worse. Its conditions get more and more miserable. The ruling class gets more and more powerful because of its foothold in property. So what a socialist revolution does, and we'll see this in Algeria too, for example, and Cuba. What it does is it takes all that alleged private property, which is often actually not even owned by the elite of a given country. It's owned by the global elite. In this case, there's a whole lot of, land holdings of Western bankers, and that's why there's this vast coalition seeking to support the Tsarist troops. So the Soviets nationalize everything, meaning that they take over these resources and they use them on their own and for their own purposes. Now the idea is that everybody, go back to Robespierre, everybody has a right to live and everybody has a right to the means of life. And so the basic idea, same things like the Iranian Revolution, there's a whole interesting history behind that one. The idea of these socialist-oriented revolutions and nationalist revolutions is to take the resources that exist within a given territory and use those resources for the true benefit of the population of that territory. That's nationalization at its roots. There's a problem with nationalization, though, which is that in name, the resources of the territory are being returned to the people of the territory. And there are a lot of ways in which, especially in Cuba and Algeria, that this is really achieved. It's achieved through a central and sometimes authoritarian government. But the resources are no longer they're not being exported anymore. They're not being used for profit on the international market. They're being used in order to sustain the population. This happens in Egypt. It happens in Libya. So Gaddafi's Libya, Libyans were fabulously rich because those resources, the oil resources in Libya, were turned to the general welfare in a whole lot of ways. Schools, hospitals, housing, living wage. These are all things that are really possible in the world if you take ownership away from a very small group of people and you give it to everybody. But of course, there's a problem hidden in this also, which is that the Soviets don't just take all of their territory, all of their oil reserves, all of their mineral reserves, all of their agricultural productive capacity, and actually just give it to the workers. They administer it. And so they're following the guidebook that's laid out in the Communist Manifesto. They centralize everything. And there's reason for this. There's good rational arguments for doing stuff like this because they want to use their assets, their productive capability, in order to satisfy the real needs of the population. And this seems to require scientific analysis and decision making. This is what is supposedly taking place. Add to this that they're very deeply aware that they are way less industrialized than the rest of the world. And so it's going to be really hard for them to keep up with the rest of the world. And so there's going to have to be a concentrated effort to develop the industrial base of the new fledgling Soviet Union. And that requires, it seems, centralization and central decision making. So this is what they do. And in a way, it's better, because probably life in the Soviet Union became better, at least for a period of 1 or 2 decades, for the poorer people. A lot of things became possible that hadn't been possible before. But then, of course, there are these really big problems, and this is what Trotsky diagnoses, which is that as time goes along, and here's the anarchist principle, right? If you put people in power, they're going to immediately feel that they deserve to be in power, and their first actions, the first thing they care about, is always going to be sustaining and growing their position of power. Trotsky says this is what happens in the Soviet Union. Lenin and the Bolsheviks succeed in setting up this centralized power, this bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy gains a life of its own. And maybe this is true for all institutions, that they have like a kind of life will or something like that. They want to sustain themselves, a survival instinct. Institutions having a kind of instinct. The instinct of every institution is, first of all, to promote itself, to sustain itself, and to expand itself. And this is what happens. Okay, now let's back up. One of the things that is most influential from Lenin is his model for how revolution should take place. And this is the theme of the book, What is to be Done? And he gives very specific answers, and they're related to this idea about taking over the state apparatus in order to be able to guard militarily by force, to guard a circumstance where you radically reallocate and restructure the economic base. This is the idea. But what are we going to do first? Okay, so here's like Lenin's typical sort of thought. It also is hierarchical. So, Lenin is like a super important revolutionary, and in being a revolutionary, he really is a part of the same movement as a lot of anarchists. But then on the other hand, there's something about hierarchy which is built into Marxist-Leninism, which is anathema to, and his reasoning is really good. I think this is one of the things you have to grapple with. His reasoning is really good, and yet the outcome I see as being ultimately this centralization of power that becomes Stalinism. And it's easy to see that Stalinism is a real problem. So what he says, he's like 1902, 1905. It's like, okay, so the revolution we want is a revolution of workers, right? There's this belief that the workers are exploited, they are dehumanized, and their basic human rights, their capacity for freedom, their capacity for sociality, are all impeded, if not destroyed, by the capitalist system. So it's got to be an anti-capitalist, socialist, worker-based revolution. But there's a problem. It looks like, and you could see this problem in the United States too. I think it's true that this exploitation happens, and yet a whole lot of American workers don't think it's happening. So this is one of Lenin's key points. He's like, it's very unlikely. It rarely is the case. Sometimes it's the case, but rarely is it the case that somebody who just works a regular factory job, say, comes around to understanding what global capitalism is, what it's rooted in, how it's exploitation, how it's passing through these different historical phases, how technological development and social development are linked in indirect ways to one another, how these things correspond to upheavals, how different factions within the capitalist class are always jockeying for power, how things like world wars have to be attributed to the functioning of capitalism. The big picture escapes the little person. And so what Lenin specifically says is, he's like, okay, now this movement towards revolution, it has to involve unionization. Unionization means the organization of the working class. You have to have that. People have to be organized at work. It has to be the case that when there's a problem, the group of people is capable of acting as a whole, and only by this means will it be able to protect its own interests. This is the idea. But Lenin says it's very rare for anybody who just works in a factory job to come around to really understanding the whole picture and understanding what needs to be done. Instead, the top level for consciousness, for understanding, for regular old working people, is what he calls trade union consciousness. So to begin with, before laborers start to get organized, back when the owners are really happy, the owners want everybody to think individually. just by themselves. This is like the right to work movement that's going on right now. Like the pushing back of union influence across the United States is premised on the ideology of individual choice. Owners love it when people think like that. It's not our problem. There is no we, there's just me. But as people work for a while in a certain circumstance, like say Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, they can start to see, although he doesn't really start, it's Filipino farm workers who start the National Federation of Farm Workers. So farm workers, like migrant pickers in California came to a point where they started to understand, well, hey, wait, we're all in this together. My situation and your situation are the same, and unless we act together in order to change that situation, it will never change, because as individuals, we are powerless. As a group, we are more powerful. And at this point, when a union movement is beginning, part of ideology is falling away, right? You're starting to see, no, the interest of the workers is always different than the interests of the owners. And ideas that we're like happily and lovingly involved with our owners is false. So it's possible for workers to get to the point where they start to see, okay, all of our interests are intertwined, and the only way that we can advance them is to unionize. But Lenin's like, that's about as far as it's going to go. These people are working all the time. They're not studying. They're not traveling all over the world. They're not analyzing capitalism. And so this is important. This whole long thing is important because the conclusion is there has to be a leadership outside of the working class. Now, it could be made up of the special individuals who were capable of seeing the whole picture, even though they rose from the ranks of the workers. But it's also going to be composed of portions of the bourgeois class, the owning class, which break off, which through academic study and analysis and some form of rare sympathy or something, break away from their class origins and become the theorists and the leaders of the power of the working class. That's the Communist Party. You can also think about it this way. He recommends very specifically how to organize yourself for revolution, how a body of people can organize themselves. So on the one hand, we need unions. Unions should be as big as possible. And every worker should be invited, welcomed into unions. But the unions are not themselves going to become revolutionary. They need revolutionary leadership. So now there's going to be a second organization stacked on top of the first, which is a bunch of little cells, vanguard cells of professional revolutionaries who are very carefully vetted. These groups have to be really secret. These people have to be very carefully trained. They have to be trained in ideology, or rather consciousness, because the idea is that what the Bolsheviks understand is objective and scientific, whereas what the workers think otherwise is false consciousness. And I think there's some merit in that, although a danger also. So there's going to be these vanguard groups, and he even goes so far as to say, a good way to do this would be to set up a newspaper or two, so that the people who are in the select revolutionary group, they have a reason to travel from one place to another. They start networking themselves together informationally. They stay in contact with the union movements and the various bases, the worker bases for their movement. But then they themselves work in secret. And that vanguard organization has to be super centralized. So, you should be thinking about terrorist cells, terrorist networks. They have very similar character to what it is that Lenin is describing. And though I think that the basic story that the Bolsheviks tell after the Bolshevik Revolution is that they did it, right? They did this thing. They set up these vanguard groups. They organized the working classes. Their story was that they did all this stuff. The real story is that there was a whole bunch of spontaneous uprising and people organized themselves, and then the Bolsheviks centralized them afterwards. One more reason for this position that Lenin has. If you don't have specialists like this, then who is going to be able to evaluate when is a good time to try to seize the state apparatus? Because not all times are equal, right? 1904, 1905 was a good time. 1917 was a good time because the Russian state apparatus was weakened by lost wars, financial difficulties, and its population was agitated due to various forms of suffering, having lost members of their family at war, having a hard time coming across food, etc. So if you don't have an expert elite, who's going to make this evaluation? If everybody else is just working 10, 12 hours a day, when are they going to actually investigate the world that they're in and come up with any idea like this? Further, it's always the case that as revolutionary movements grow, secret police apparatuses grow too. And so a revolutionary movement has to know how to deal with very sophisticated policing and military suppression of revolution. That's why these people have to be trained. They have to be trained in like military strategy. They have to understand police techniques. Can you really expect workers who are working 10 to 12 hours a day, can you really expect them to generate this knowledge? The Leninist answer is no, you can't. So you need an expert elite. That expert elite becomes, it's on the one hand, it's the Communist Party to begin with, or it's a part of it, but it becomes the leadership of the new revolutionary government. And then the problem that Trotsky gives us, and here I'm just wrapping up, the problem with that is that once that centralized, specialized, small group of people ends up in a position of absolute power, because now they control both the state resources and the entirety of the economy. The Politburo is deciding who's going to work where, what machinery are we going to have, what are we going to manufacture, and how much of it, how's it going to be shipped, where are we going to get the raw materials. All these economic questions are controlled from Moscow, but then all the police forces, which Lenin puts in place a new secret police force, the Cheka, which eventually becomes the KGB. There's now this like centralized hold on power, and what Trotsky says is he's like, look, you know, the whole theory, and he was down with all this stuff, right? But the whole theory was that this vanguard was to relax its hold on power. You need a same thing as in like the French Revolution. You need a period of the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to kill off the class enemies, because you can't be so naive as to think that there's such a thing as like a revolution without enemies. But then the state apparatus ought to like settle down and become basically nothing but like, you know, administrative offices without radical hierarchical power. But this doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is that bureaucracy continues to grow itself. It continues to become more and more totalitarian. And effectively, the working conditions for Soviet factory workers don't seem to be any different than the working conditions for capitalist factory workers. They still have to go in. They still get very little pay. They still have no control over what production is taking place. All that's different is that the Soviets say they are working on behalf of the working class, and of course this is what like the ruling class everywhere says, hey, our interests are the same. And they're not selling the commodities on an international market, not for the most part. But in a lot of ways, the revolution is a failure. You know, the revolution is betrayed, according to Trotsky. And in, you know, middle of the 1930s, he thought there was still a chance for the Russian population to push the bureaucracy out of control. There basically had to be a continued revolution, or the bureaucracy was going to have to break the revolutionary will of the people. And that's basically what happens. By the 1950s, we have an effectively totalitarian situation, and there's no more real movement. There's no big faction of the population who could feasibly move towards full real communism. So full real communism or socialism would mean from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, right? Everybody just works willingly because that's what we need as a group, as a country. And everybody gets everything that they need. And we will have developed habits of, you know, a good work ethic and not too much selfishness. This is the dream of where we could get to in terms of full communism. And it was always going to come in like 5 years. There were all these 5-year plans. But it was effectively made impossible because this centralized power always operated to keep itself as a centralized power. So, okay. So that's the stuff. Now let me give you a couple of questions. The real question is the one that I asked at the beginning. Do you buy Lenin's analysis of these wars? Whose war is it? Whose war is the war in Iraq? Is it really yours? Should we really say we went into Iraq? You know, even if you're a veteran and you went into Iraq, was it your war or was it somebody else's? And if you were told that you're going there in order to liberate Iraq and bring freedom to them, and then you saw that that didn't happen, didn't you feel betrayed? Who is we? Is we everybody who is American? Is we the American government? Or can there be a different we, which could be the we of the working class, or the we even of a local working situation, the we of our classroom? And it's this last one that I really believe in, and that is troubled by the online format here too.